He was a village carpenter. He believed in God and dreamed of one day becoming a priest. But fate had other plans. Vasily Ivanovich Chapaev would become a great commander. He created an invincible army of angry proletarians and peasants. His soldiers were willing to die for their commander. Nobody knew that he had become a hero by chance. All because of a betrayal of the woman Chapaev loved the most. The woman he begged twice to come back to him. You will learn the truth about the Red Army's commander from the mouths of his officers. You will learn how the legend of Vasily Ivanovich and his comrades Petka and Anka was born. Why Petka's wife committed suicide and who Anka, the machine gunner, was. For the first time, we will question the rumor that Vasily Chapaev was killed crossing the Ural River. How did he manage to survive? And how did his life actually end?
They saw a man dragged to the other side of the river.
Who killed the famous divisional commander and why? How was the legend of an exemplary movie hero created out of the dead Chapaev? And what did his family have to conceal for so many years? During Soviet rule, this man had been the most popular hero of the Civil War. His name was known to every schoolboy. Factories, schools, villages and towns were named after him. In the Ukraine alone, there are still 16 Chapaevka towns, 6 Chapaevo villages, and more than 30,000 streets named after Chapaev. It all began with Stalin's order to create the first Soviet movie hero.
1934. The Soviet viewers became hysterical. Every evening, enormous crowds gathered at cinemas and clubs around the country. For several months, there was only one movie showing. A full-length film of Vasilyev brothers Chapaev. It was a movie about a war hero, selflessly devoted to the party. He cared only about the greater good, but those who knew the divisional commander personally didn't admire him. The Red Army soldiers watched the film with indignation, not recognizing their commander in actor Boris Babochin. The real Chapaev had no interest in politics. He didn't support any particular party and was always in control of his emotions. How dare you make fun of Chapaev? I'll shoot you, bastard!
At the back of the cinema, gazing up at Chapaev and the lovers Petka and Anka, a woman was weeping. She was the real widow of Petka, Petra Isiev. He had really served in Chapaev's division, but actually as a career officer. What about Anka, the machine gunner? Was she fiction? No. This image was taken from Maria Popova, a nurse who worked in Chapaev's division. During a battle, Maria was trying to save a wounded soldier. But Petra Isiev forced her to fire at enemies with a machine gun. So a terrified Maria accidentally killed several dozen whites with a machine gun. This is how Anka the machine gunner was born. She had never had a close relationship with Petra Isiev, but the Soviet cinema portrayed otherwise. In despair, the widow of Petka sent dozens of letters to Stalin asking to either refute or give evidence of her husband's unfaithfulness. She didn't know that it had been Stalin who had added a plotline about Anka and Petka being lovers. That's why he wouldn't reply to the letters. Meanwhile, gossip amongst the neighbors increased. Petra Isyev's wife could not stand it any longer and hanged herself. No one else seemed to have any complaints about the legendary film. The movie had been a triumph.
Vasily Chapaev's children silently watched the movie exploits of their father, but they did not recognize what they were watching. The oldest of the three children, Sasha, remembered how the whole family had seen their father off to the front. Reality was completely different from the movie.
For the first time that evening, the children were allowed to go to bed late. After dinner, they stayed up. Their father and mother had disappeared, but Sasha knew their parents were preparing a surprise. Vasily Chapaev enjoyed putting on shows for his children. He loved watching their happy faces. The image of his handsome face, nice figure, smart clothes, and huge moustache was imprinted on his children's memory. By the age of 27, Vasily Chapaev had everything he wanted: job, family, and a beloved wife. The only thing that bothered him since he was a child was his relationship with his tyrannical father. When Vasily was a little child, his father used to beat him, and as a grown man, he tried to control his actions and humiliate him. Chapaev was desperate to leave, and even considered becoming a priest.
Само желание стать священником с точки зрения психологии не что иное, как поиск идеального отца.
In psychological terms, becoming a priest is seen as the search for the perfect father through an unconditionally loving and forgiving patriarchal God.
А значит, молодого Василия Ивановича не устраивали его родители. С психологической точки зрения это глубинный.
From the psychological point of view, all he wanted was to prove himself to his father. It's said that George W. Bush suffered from the same complex.
Vasily ran away from his parents and enrolled at a parish school where he dreamed of one day entering the priesthood.
He had no idea how different his destiny would turn out to be. Instead of a church choir, he would end up listening to the sound of gunfire.
In Moscow, we tracked down the great-great-granddaughter of Vasily Chapaev. She was named after her outstanding grandfather, Vasilisa. At 17, the girl knew everything about him. The family archive had been given to her by Claudia, Vasily Ivanovich's daughter and Vasilisa's grandmother. From old photographs and letters, she realized that the most important thing that had ever happened to her grandfather was meeting his future wife. The beautiful, dark-haired Pelageya worked as a packer at the town confectionery. It was she who encouraged him to oppose his tyrannical father.
It was love at first sight. Vasily Chapaev himself was very elegant and well built, and obviously he looked after himself. Pelageya was fragile, small, and incredibly beautiful. She had huge dark eyes, and everyone who met her fell for her. So these two strong and beautiful, passionate people had found each other.
But when they told their relatives about their decision, there was a scandal. Pelageya's family didn't want their daughter to marry a simple carpenter, a worker from a poor family. And Chapaev's parents had taken an instant dislike to their daughter-in-law. who they thought wouldn't make a good housewife. She took it very hard and suggested they live at her place, but Chapaev flatly refused, saying he would never live with his wife's family. And so Pelageya moved to his house, where her life would become a living hell. The first years of marriage were happy. Children were born. It seemed nothing could get in the way of their happiness. But then war broke out. Chapaev, like many men from his village, was forcibly enlisted. He reluctantly signed up. He didn't know what would become of him. He longed for the war to end so that he could return to his family. Unexpectedly, the Austrians attacked. Vasily couldn't stand the gunfire, the explosions, the cries of the wounded, and all the blood. He couldn't move, and so he took cover and didn't fire a single shot. Although ashamed of his fear, he couldn't help himself. He just wanted to go home. Meanwhile, Pelageya and the children were having a terrible time back at his parents' house. While Vasily was away, his parents took out their anger for their son's disobedience on his wife and children. Pelageya was blamed for everything. Her father-in-law beat her for the smallest thing, as once he had done with his own son. Deciding she couldn't handle it anymore, Pelageya began to pack her things. But Chapaev's parents removed their grandchildren by force, allowing their daughter-in-law to go. Chapaev didn't know any of this. He couldn't imagine what was going on at home. He didn't care about becoming a hero. He was just waiting for the right moment to make his escape. It's hard to believe that Vasily Chapaev, as recorded in the archive documents of the time, returned from World War I as a holder of the Order of St. George. He won all 4 medals for bravery while fighting on the front. But how did this cowardly village carpenter become such a hero? In 1915, a single letter from his father changed Chapaev's fate forever. Pelageya has run away without telling anyone. She packed her things and went to find her lover. She left her children with us. At first, he couldn't believe it was true. But because of the effects of the war, he was convinced that she'd been unfaithful. Now it made no sense to go back home. Vasily couldn't get over his wife's betrayal. His family had been his life. So when Pelageya left, Chapaev decided he had nothing to live for. At that moment, there was a call to arms. The commander quickly mustered his soldiers. The Austrians took up the rear. Chapaev threw himself into the battle. He didn't care if he lived or died. Suddenly, everything went blank. He grabbed his head and saw that his hands were covered in blood. He wanted to scream, but collapsed and couldn't get up.
At the small Carpathian village Snovidov, Russian troops retreated, leaving several hundred dead. Vasily Chapaev was among them. Austro-Hungarians occupied the position of the Russian army and put 2 guards near the village. That night, while everyone was asleep, one of the dead suddenly stirred. He had no idea how long he'd been unconscious. He was thirsty and in pain. Suddenly, he heard whispering. "Oh Lord, save us sinners." It was the prayer of a wounded man lying beside him that made a lasting impression on Chapaev. Vasily, who believed in God, took this as a sign, and although badly injured, stood up and attacked the guards. He stunned one and captured the other. As a reward for capturing the 2 prisoners, he received the Cross of St. George of the 3rd degree. He no longer felt like a coward or a cheated husband, but a hero. When a man loses his will to live, he will often perform great deeds of bravery. Thus, he was transformed from a reckless peasant to a dashing officer. His desire to prove himself to his wife was strong. Chapaev was reborn as a fearless warrior, leading every battle. In a single year, Vasily Chapaev went from being a private soldier to a non-commissioned officer. He became infamous for his risky but always successful combat operations, for which he received full status of a St. George Knight. This is what was written in the papers accompanying his awards. Capturing fortifications occupied by the enemy, Vasily Ivanovich Chapaev led his people, setting an example through his bravery and heroism. He encouraged and inspired his people to follow him, and despite being seriously wounded, he would always return to the battlefield after his wounds had been dressed. Chapaev was surrounded by glory. Everyone called him a hero. For his excellent service, the commander decided to make him a special gift. 3 weeks' leave. At last, Vasily could go home. A year ago, that was all he'd wanted. Now, it was unbearable to go back to his village, where the locals would have seen him not as a hero, but a miserable, abandoned husband. Vasily, thinking of Pelageya, hesitated. Finally, he decided to confront her about her behavior. Chapaev replayed the conversation over and over in his head. When they finally met, he was lost for words. Chapaev realized that it had been untrue and that she had suffered badly. To celebrate their reunion, they went into town and took a photo. Here is the only shot of the couple together. At that moment, they thought they would never part. Chapaev's parents admitted their mistakes and welcomed her back into the family. Chapaev warned them that if anything happened to Pelageya, he would never forgive them. His father didn't dare argue with his son anymore.
Pelageya did not believe that her parents-in-law's attitude towards her would ever change. She was terrified of being left alone with them without Vasily. She begged her husband, "Stay here, don't go back to war. What about me and the children?" She realized that the man standing before her was no longer a simple carpenter who had once dreamed of a quiet family life, but a brutal and resolute military leader, the commander Vasily Chapaev. Next up, while the war takes away the most precious thing in his life, family and love, it also brings him incredible popularity. He becomes an invincible Red Army commander, an idol for his soldiers and a dangerous enemy for his opposition. The mystery of Divisional Commander Vasily Chapaev's death. Who raised him from the dead and for what purpose? Why did Chapaev become the people's idol? When Chapaev's short leave ended, he was called to the front again. But where would he go? After the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia. The Civil War had started. People just like Chapaev had to choose who and what to fight for. The Tsarist army had always regarded him as a simple, uneducated peasant, and although he commanded many troops, the officers showed him no respect. Chapaev felt certain they would never accept him as their own, as the Bolsheviks didn't care whether he had finished a military academy. During the war, the Bolsheviks inflamed passions by encouraging people to bring down the bourgeoisie and divide up their wealth amongst honest people. Was forcibly removing wealth from the powers that be and dividing it amongst the poor such a bad thing? Vasily Ivanovich didn't think so and followed this path. His methods were as severe as they had been in wartime. For rioting and robbery, perpetrators were beaten with whips. For gambling, officers were stripped of their rank. Those found chasing after local women were imprisoned for 3 days. These were the first orders of the new commander. Due to lack of staff, former non-commissioned officers were now particularly valuable to the army. The Great Patriotic War showed that many of the Soviet military's most outstanding leaders, such as Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, came via this route. This stern, high-quality group of old soldiers made reliable commanders. Chapaev was determined to make good soldiers of these people. He would teach them everything he knew in order to save their lives. After all, their wives and children were waiting for them at home, just like his. He protected his soldiers as if they were family, but was unable to protect himself. 1918. The empire is seized with chaos. Battles for power continue. Bandits are overrunning villages. Pelageya is still waiting for her husband. She hasn't seen Vasily for 6 months. During this time, she received no news from him. In those days, the postal service was unreliable, and Chapaev's letters never reached his wife. Pelageya refused to believe that her husband had forgotten about her. She was afraid that something had happened to him. She hated this house, in which she had never been in charge, where her every move was watched, and she was constantly told what to do. But then one day, everything would change when famine struck the village. People were running away from the village and heading for the towns in search of work and food.
When her 3-year-old son could no longer stand up because of hunger, Pelageya took away her children and left. Meanwhile, several hundred kilometers away from his village, Chapaev and his soldiers pushed the enemy northwards, following the Bolsheviks' commands. Chapaev's troops had to defend the borders between Saratov and Uralsk. For 6 months, Chapaev managed the impossible. He created a powerful army out of former peasants, 800 highly trained soldiers who blindly trusted their commander. Chapaev felt a cultural affinity with his soldiers, as he too was a peasant. They breathed the same air and laughed at the same jokes. He remained on the front line, ate with his troops, and swore like them. In 1918, Chapaev's division received a telegram from Trotsky asking him to repress the White Guard uprising in Izhevsk town. It was a simple order, but unlike previous ones, he failed in this task. At Izhevsk, instead of White Guard soldiers, he was greeted by a peaceful crowd of men, women and children dressed in dirty clothes. They made a lasting impression on him. They were simple proletarians, people the Red Army was supposed to defend. Chapaev couldn't understand why he had orders to shoot them. They were just like him and his soldiers. Chapaev could not imagine what the real reason for the rebellion was. He didn't know that the Bolsheviks had taken almost all the provisions from Izhevsk to satisfy the Red Army's needs. Thus, famine struck the town, and in despair, people rebelled. Chapaev's division had to repress this rebellion. Unaware of the situation, the divisional commander couldn't give the order. Not a single shot was heard in Izhevsk that day. After what he had seen in Izhevsk, Chapaev's eyes opened. For the first time, he realized that hunger and poverty had gripped the country. Like bandits, the Red soldiers robbed people. Chapaev was frightened for the first time. How had his family survived for all this time? Had they received his letters and money? Did they have food? Chapaev needed to know. The first chance he had, he jumped on his horse and galloped home. He was greeted by an empty village. Vasily rushed to his home. There was no one in. Had they been killed, or were they hiding? In despair, he rode to the place he had found his wife before, her parents' house. But when he saw Pelageya, he felt numb. He looked at her, but she turned away. Vasily knew she had betrayed him. After the war, he'd always been away. It had been very hard for her to run a full household with no money and her father-in-law always hovering over her. She left, not because of Chapaev's absence, but because of the burdens of her life. Chapaev could and would not understand that. He took away their children by force and brought them back to his parents. Pelageya begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. After his breakup with Pelageya, Vasily rarely visited his house. Whenever he did, he would take his beloved daughter Claudia in his arms and sigh. She told me that once he took her on his knees and made her headscarf like this. He said, "Klavdyunya, you're so beautiful, so beautiful." And she said, "Daddy, why? Why am I so beautiful?" With such a pain, he said, "Because you're the image of that dark-eyed bitch, your mother." He loved and remembered her for the rest of his life.
Little Claudia remembered well the last time her mother visited. Pelageya was staring up at the house for hours, unable to get in. When she turned away to leave, her daughter ran after her. My grandmother ran after her, grabbing her skirt. There were many buttons on her skirt. She grabbed the flapping skirt, crying, "Mummy, wait, please, don't go." But Pelageya didn't even turn around. And then my grandmother fell in the road, bursting into tears. Ever after, she would say, "I don't have a mother anymore." The children understood everything much later, but even then, they held a terrible grudge. Their father and relatives used to say she was heartless.
Любая женщина претендует на то, чтобы человек, которого она считает своим мужем и мужем любимым.
Any woman and her children should be protected by a man, especially her beloved husband.
Продемонстрировал своей Пелагее неготовность и неспособность ее защитить.
But Chapaev repeatedly demonstrated his inability to protect them from his parents, from the hunger and from the fights. Chapaev's main question shouldn't be, "Have you betrayed me, Pelageya?" But, "You know, Pelageya, who is beside you? The great Chapaev." After breaking up with Pelageya, the legendary commander started to hate women. He would avenge them for his own pain and betrayal of his ex-wife for the rest of his life. He would have many lovers, but no love. His only consolation would be the war, and his only family, the soldiers. Since then, he was giving his fatherly love to his men. In return, the soldiers treated Chapaev as their father. He was not just adored, they were willing to die for him. Yet Chapaev never took risks. He worked out every military operation in detail. He ignored orders from the command if he considered them reckless. He spared the prisoners of war. Soon, the father commander's fame spread across the Urals. People from all over signed up asking to serve under the father's wing, and he accepted them all. Within a few months, his division had grown from 800 to 10,000 people. This fact wasn't ignored in Moscow. They started watching Chapaev more carefully. Leon Trotsky was terribly displeased with what he heard. It was reported that Chapaev compared himself to Napoleon and regretted that in the past he hadn't finished his studies. He had dreamed of becoming a marshal, and the strength of his personality was enormous. He was hypnotizing people, revitalizing them with his energy. They would follow him through thick and thin, even during a rebellion. Chapaev often disobeyed orders from superiors because it would have meant certain death. He acted honorably, and if that meant executing someone, it was always for the right reasons. Trotsky never forgave Chapaev for the incident in Izhevsk. He didn't appreciate anyone who questioned the authority of the party. Trotsky mercilessly struggled against people like Chapaev, Shores and Kotovsky for their unauthorized activities. They took their troops to battle without permission. They were unpredictable, and for this reason, dangerous. An uncontrollable army is a menace to any state. Trotsky was aware of this. He knew that he couldn't control such Chapaevs from Moscow. He needed his own people on site, who would closely watch the actions of the suspicious commanders. For that purpose, a new executive position, the People's Commissar, was created in the Red Army. These people were sent to all divisions in the front. Officially, their job was to carry out the party's propaganda in the army. CRU is the authority of landowners and bourgeoisie. In fact, they were watching every step of the commanders. In Chapaev's division, the commissar was Dmitry Furmanov, a party worker. Furmanov was the direct opposite of Chapaev. He graduated from Moscow University, was an active participant in all of the Bolsheviks' rallies, and was a fine debater. Young and inspired, Furmanov easily gained Trotsky's confidence, who saw in him a promising agitator and faithful ally. His personality has drawn my attention. I'm watching him all the time. Everywhere, Chapaev is greeted with enthusiasm. His popularity is enormous. Every little boy knows his name. Later, Furmanov used these notes to write a novel dedicated to Vasily Chapaev. His real attitude towards the divisional commander could be found in the pages of his small notebook. Furmanov wrote of Chapaev as a conceited careerist, an authoritarian who reveled in power. His pocket notebook had been kept in the Moscow State Archives for a long time. Now it's published, and anyone can read it. From these very notes, researchers have learned about the true commissar's attitude to Chapaev. In the book, the comrades are actually enemies. What is the reason for this discrepancy? Why didn't they like each other? Everything was decided at their first encounter. Chapaev was hurrying to the headquarters. Furmanov, a party member who couldn't wait to ask the commander a few questions, had arrived in Moscow. But in the commissar's house, a surprise awaited Chapaev. It was Furmanov's wife, Anna. The commander swore, stamped his feet, and shouted at Furmanov to immediately send his wife home. His barracks were no place for women, as they were a distraction. Furmanov didn't obey. This had to be resolved in Moscow. But Chapaev couldn't wait. He decided to use cunning to humiliate Furmanov in front of his wife. By Chapaev's order, they brought to her letters supposedly directed to her husband. The commander hoped that a woman's natural curiosity would prevail, and it did. Anna Furmanova read those letters. Chapaev wrote to Furmanov saying that he was welcome to share his women. The documents were genuine. Furmanov was possibly collecting them as evidence on Chapaev's immorality. Chapaev didn't care how serious the consequences would be. He just hated that party supervisor. Furmanov had gone too far. He had disobeyed his orders and criticized the military operation. He was just an ignorant parasite. Firstly, no one would like to be the supervisor of the commander. Secondly, the commissars constantly interfered and snooped around the military command. "I'm a man of war, a commander," he would say. "Who are you to mess with me?" He wasn't aware that a secret order based on Comrade Furmanov's reports had been ready in Moscow. Recently, at a commanders and commissars meeting, he was furiously shouting about commissarcracy. In my opinion, Chapaev is an unprincipled and dangerous careerist, capable of revenge in case of failure. Furmanov's reports made Trotsky even more suspicious. He needed to act quickly, because Chapaev was becoming a menace. The division worships him and obeys his every command.
What would happen if he decided to start another revolution? He couldn't take that chance. A trap had been set for Chapaev. The main units of the commander's division were ordered by the High Command to go south and help the Red troops. Only 300 soldiers were left in Chapaev's barracks. The commander was nervous and asked for reinforcements. But only 2 aeroplanes were sent to help him. Pilots were instructed to patrol from above and report the situation. Meanwhile, the White Command mysteriously received a message. Chapaev's headquarters were unprotected. Now was his chance. The Whites rapidly prepared for the attack. Pilots keeping watch over the Ural steppe didn't report anything suspicious. The steppe was well within view as there were no forests. The pilots reported that everything was quiet. In fact, an attack was imminent, and Chapaev suspected a conspiracy. He wrote to all commanders and commissars, "I'm loyal, and if you want my life, just come and take it. Why risk the lives of people who are faithful to me?" Chapaev never received an answer. That night, his headquarters were attacked by the Whites. Chapaev and his soldiers retreated to the riverside of the Urals, where he was seriously wounded. "You won't get me!" This is the most dramatic episode of the Soviet film Chapaev. Legendary commander disappears in the waters of the Urals. This was the official version of his death. But how did he actually die? It's hard to believe, but Chapaev actually crossed the Urals. He didn't drown despite his wounds. The KGB archives provide evidence that the soldiers brought the divisional commander to the other side of the Urals. They recalled that at that time, Chapaev was unconscious because of blood loss. But there'd been a chance that he could live. Here lies the mystery of the commander's death. What happened to him on the other side of the Urals? This only became apparent years after, when the KGB archives were partly declassified. In it, there was evidence contradicting the official version. They saw a man being dragged to the other side of the river. They then all disappeared in the reeds. Prisoners' statement confirmed these reports. Then a few more from his group who had broken through to the Asian side of the Urals were caught. They said that he'd died and that they'd buried him there. No one will ever know the real story. Vasily Chapaev's grave was never found. To avoid any scandal, the story of the divisional commander's death was fabricated. That is when his heroic death in the raging waters of the Urals was announced. The news of Chapaev's death made Pelageya rush to her children. During the winter of 1919, she went to the village on foot, but she never arrived. Her frozen body was found not far from the village. Pelageya, who was 7 months pregnant, hadn't managed to get her children back. After the death of Chapaev's parents, little Claudia and her 2 brothers were taken to an orphanage, where they lived till their maturity. The 2 boys followed in their father's footsteps. One became the commander of an artillery brigade during the Second World War. The other one served as a military pilot. Chapaev's only daughter, Claudia, devoted her life to his memory. For a long time, she'd been campaigning and eventually got access to the classified archives. She was not allowed to tamper with the documents. Then, Claudia Chapaeva resorted to cunning. She'd go there every day. She would take off all her rings, bracelets and watch and put her hands on the table. The archivist would turn the pages for her. She would be reading one document for 2 hours, and then she would go to the ladies' room and hide it under her clothes. This was how she managed to carry a number of documents out of the archives. It was Claudia who discovered the mystery of the commander's death. She learned that her father was betrayed by his own party. In 1934, Chapaev's children watched the movie about their father, causing them great pain. They knew the sad truth, but they couldn't tell anyone. Nobody could have believed that the Soviet regime would murder Chapaev and then glorify him as a faithful servant of the party in a film. The ordinary carpenter, who due to his wife's betrayal had become a hero, was gone. A brilliant non-commissioned officer of the Tsarist army, a full knight of St. George who achieved many victories, was no more. A rebellious and powerful divisional commander who could have become a famous Soviet general and organize a military uprising against the Bolsheviks was dead.